So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. First of all, I think that on behalf of, those of us that attended the official dinner, we should thank the organizers for the meal, and especially for the amazing show that we enjoyed last night. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Rachel Giora, professor of linguistics at Tel Aviv University. Among her research interests, as you all know, are language and ideology, women and language, the psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics of figurative language, irony, jokes, metaphor, figurative language and Asperger's syndrome, and discourse negation. Her book, On Our Mind, Salience, Context, and Figurative Language, was published by Oxford University Press in 2003. She was a co-editor of Noga, the Israeli feminist magazine, for over 20 years. And she's a member of Boycott, supporting the Palestinian BDS call from within. So today, she will deliver a lecture on negation and metaphor. The title is, I'm Not Your Maid, Negation as a Metaphor Inducing Operator. So please join me in welcoming Rachel. Yes.
Well, of course, I wouldn't be able to compete with yesterday's night show, but I hope to be able to, teach you a few things about negation. Negation has been one of my favorite topics recently, and I found something really interesting, I think, about the operator which can induce metaphoricity. And this is what I'll try to show you today. The talk will be divided into two. In the first part, I'll report results of our experiment. And in the second part, I'll report results of two corpus-assisted studies. Okay, the talk will focus on utterances such as, I'm not your maid, this is not food, the affirmative counterparts, I'm your maid, this is food, which potentially are ambiguous between literal and metaphoric interpretation. Especially, this is interesting, especially because these interpretations are allowed outside of a specific context. Okay, so the question I'll be asking today is, what is the plausible, or actually default context of negative utterances of the type such as, I'm not your maid, this is not food? I'll try to show you that to render such statements meaningful, addressees often activate a context in which the negative predicate is related to the topic in a non-literal way, in a metaphoric way. So here is one example. You tell me what to do all of the time, what to say, where to hide, what to do. I'm not your wife, I'm not your maid. I'm not someone that you can lay your demands on all of the time. I'm sick of this. It's going to stop. So the question is, what does the speaker reject when she says, I'm not your maid? Well, she does not reject metaphor irrelevant meanings, such as an employed woman hired to do her job. She rejects metaphor relevant meanings, such as someone that you can lay your demands on all of the time. Okay, let's have a look at this one. This is not food. Tell TBS this is not food. They should concentrate on checking upon foodstuff imports, many of which are expired or substandard or unfit for human consumption. So again, the question is, what does the speaker reject when she says this is not food? Apparently it is, right? She does not reject metaphor irrelevant meanings such as foodstuff. She rejects metaphor-relevant meanings, such as standard or fit for human consumption. Okay, let's have a look at the affirmative counterparts, such as you're made, this is food. And let's see what is the plausible default context of such affirmatives. Well, I'll try to show you that to render such statements meaningful, addressees often activate a context in which the predicate is related to the topic in a literal way. So here is one example. No, Mom, I'm your maid. It is you who picked me. It is my job to attend to you, Mom. Okay, so what does the speaker communicate when she says, I'm your maid? Well, I'd like to contend that she communicates metaphor-irrelevant meanings, such as employed woman hired to do her job. Let's have a look at the other example, the other affirmative statement. This is food grown by local farmers. What does the speaker communicate when she says this is food? She communicates metaphor-irrelevant meanings, such as foodstuff. Okay, so after presenting you with a few examples and letting you have the feel of what I'm going to talk about, I'll actually go into trying to share with you the idea that negation is really very creative, and that negation is an operator inducing novel, non-literal interpretations by default. Okay, for a novel, non-literal interpretation to be a default, it has to meet the following conditions. Well, naturally, if I'm talking about novel interpretations, it has to be, items have to be unfamiliar. So constituents have to be unfamiliar so that salient, coded, or non-literal interpretations or meaning of expressions and collocations, such as coded non-literal meanings of familiar, idiomatic, metaphoric, ironic, or any formulaic expression, prefabs, conventionalized, ritualistic, situation-bound utterances such that occur in standardized communicative situations should be excluded. So anything that would, project familiar, coded, salient, conventional, non-literal interpretation should be excluded if we want to show that negation can induce novel, non-literal interpretation by default. Okay, the second requirement, the second condition requires that semantic anomaly would be excluded because it is known to trigger metaphoricity. Also some kind of internal incongruency, some opposition between two elements of the phrase itself, which are known to trigger ironicity, should be excluded so that literal and non-literal interpretations would be permissible. And this is really a very important point, in order to attempt to argue that negation can induce non-literalness by default, the utterance has to be at least interpretable both literally and non-literally outside of a specific context. And here we come to the condition that has to do with contextual information. Sorry. So obviously specific and informative contextual information should be avoided, so that pragmatic incongruity, such as a breach of pragmatic maxims or contextual misfit on the one hand, and supportive biasing information on the other, may not invite a non-literal interpretation. We want to avoid all kinds of conditions which would encourage non-literal interpretation. And the last condition has specifically to do with negative items. Negative items should not be negative polarity items, because negative polarity items tend to have conventional meanings, and we want to avoid that. We want to have negative items that have affirmative counterparts which are acceptable. So in order to avoid such conventionality, these utterances should not be negative polarity items. That is, they should be as widely accepted, the affirmative counterpart should be as widely accepted as the negative utterance. Okay, with this in mind, let's now plunge into the experiments. Well, what we will be testing is the hypothesis that negation generates figurativeness via highlighting some metaphor-relevant features of the concept within its scope, while rendering its metaphor-irrelevant, literal features pragmatically irrelevant, regardless of whether they are true or false. Okay, so specifically what we would predicate is an asymmetric behavior, some negative utterances of the form x is not y will be interpreted metaphorically compared to their affirmative counterparts. In experiment 1, we compared negative versus affirmative statements, and we predicted, and this is going to be our prediction all along, that negative items will be judged as more metaphoric than their affirmative counterparts. Well, in this experiment, we asked students to actually make a decision, an either-or decision. You'll see in a second. Well, participants were 48 Tel Aviv University students or native speakers of Hebrew, and they were presented items such as these ones. This is life, this is not life, this is food, this is not food, this is a game, this is not a game. You're my boss, you're not my boss. You're my mom, you're not my mom. I'm your secretary, I'm not your secretary. Well, finally, the old